Welcome back to the Creating Resilience video series. This is the 13th video in the series, and we are talking about how to respond when others are reacting. We've talked about if somebody's in the trunk of their brain, that we want to use grounding, breathing, and movement techniques. Some of those techniques are also very useful if somebody's just in their backseat and emotional. We know that all three of those can be very useful to help us move from the back seat to the front seat because we're providing connection within our own body. Sometimes, though, people want connection with someone else. And if you remember, we talked about the root of the tree, attunement. So you can use the attunement steps to validate an emotion and create some connection as well as some other things that we'll talk about for connection. And then if somebody's in that front seat, how do we meet that need? How do we talk things through when someone's actually in their front seat? So let's start with the connection piece. And the idea here is that we want to be able to identify and name that emotion for somebody else, but we also want to help them name it to tame it. There's great research that shows that if you actually state, I feel angry, it shifts you from the back seat of your brain towards the front of your brain because you're taking that emotion and you're actually putting it into words. Naming it actually tames that emotion some. We want to be able to not only name it and tame it for somebody else, but encourage them to also name that emotion by saying, I feel upset. I feel worried. We can meet other connection needs by engaging in side-by-side conversation. So after we've used our validation of emotions, then we can actually ask them, do you want to take a walk? It's really helpful, especially to people who have had a lot of issues with authority figures in the past. It's very helpful for them to have somebody walk side by side. Sometimes the face to face and the eye to eye contact, it can be intimidating and put people in their back seat. I don't know if you've had teenage kids or not. I have, and I tell you, driving in a car and having conversations is a lot easier with teenagers sometimes because they just feel more at ease without being face to face. Another thing you can do to really help meet those connection needs is just to have routine check-ins. Make sure throughout the day, if you have somebody that tends to get into their backseat often, make sure that you check in with them and ask them, where are they in their car? How are they feeling? What emotion are they having? Validating that, regulating with that if you need to. And then make sure you're using attunement in the positive moments as well. We talked about that briefly when we talked about attunement, but make sure that you are naming and validating emotions that are positive emotions, not just the stressful, difficult ones. And notice people's strengths and let them know that you see those strengths. That really helps build connection too. We all like to hear how other people think we're doing things the right way. When we're in that front seat anyway, and we're trying to find some meaning, we can then begin to really talk and become curious and share ideas. That's where the front seat really excels. And so when we're meeting the needs there, we might be problem solving. Sometimes that's what we're doing. And that requires our executive functions of working memory, flexible attention, and control. Understand too that problem solving is only possible from the front seat of the brain. Lots of times when people are still upset or maybe even still behaving in their trunk behaviors, we're trying to problem solve with them. We're trying to ask them, what's the problem? What do you need to do differently than what you're doing now? But in fact, first we need to provide the safety and connection before we can actually start to walk through the steps of problem solving. Problem solving really is the very first thing is just to notice and name what the problem is and make sure you get it accurate. Sometimes people go into their blaming phase here. So make sure that you are really finding truly the problem at hand. If you need to, at this point, even after naming the problem, if you need to calm more to get to the front part of the brain, do some more regulation. And then begin to think of as many different ideas as you can to solve that problem. We call this brainstorming, and sometimes you need ideas from other people. Always try to help the person come up with their own ideas. You might make some suggestions. And then think about the consequences of every single solution you've come up with. What are the good things that will happen when you do it that way? And what are the not so good things that will happen if you do it that way? And then choose a solution. Choose which way you want to try to do it and give it a try. If you give it a try and it works out really well, then you get to celebrate. If you give it a try and it doesn't work out so well, then you have to kind of go back to your list of ideas and choose another option to try. So this is just a very basic problem solving, but you can see how it has multiple steps that kind of build on each other, and that each step requires us to be in the front part of our brain. You also want to be really proactive to try to keep people in the front seat of their brain once they're there. So you want to always pay attention to behaviors you want to see more of. For example, as a teacher, when I first worked with pre-K students, they're 4 years old and they're supposed to be sitting crisscross while I read them a book. I was a counselor. I went to school for counseling and did therapy, and here I am suddenly in a classroom. I'd never had classroom management at all. And I went into the other pre-K teachers' classrooms to see how do they get these kiddos to sit while they're reading them a book. And what was amazing is they would bring them to the circle and the teacher would start pointing out, I love the way that Susie's sitting crisscross. Oh, and Johnny has his hands in his lap and Billy's lips are quiet and listening. It's like all the other kids would suddenly do these positive behaviors the teacher was pointing out. It's in our nature to want to be praised and to be accepted. So point out what behaviors people are doing that are really good and you'll see more of them. You want to offer routine regulation, not only for yourself, but for others as well. So at home, build regulation into routines, and we will keep saying that over the next several videos. At work, build routine into staff meetings and meetings with clients and meetings with coworkers. And then make sure that you pay attention to the clues of somebody else and try to catch them before they get really deep into their back seat. The story I told you about with the teacher that noticed that her child would put their hands like this before they would have an explosive outbreak. Try to capture that before and step in with validation and regulation. We also want to think about our expectations and boundaries. Expectations and boundaries should never be decreased, especially for somebody that has experienced a lot of trauma or stress in their lives. Don't think, oh, I'll just make life easier on them, because what they really do, they're so important. They help us know that other people think we're worthy. If I have a much lower expectation than somebody else at my workplace, then I'm going to assume that my boss thinks I'm not as good as that other person. But if I have the same expectations, even if I struggle to meet them sometimes, I know that they have faith that I can meet them. So expectations and boundaries are very, very important. Everything needs to be in very simple steps. For example, with a child, if you're working with a child, instead of saying, go clean up your room, you might say, let's go in your room and let's put all the dirty clothes in the dirty clothes bin. And do that. Praise that. Woohoo, do a little celebration. The next might be, let's put all the toys that belong on the shelf on the shelf. Do that. Praise, celebrate. Now let's put all the toys that belong in the toy box there. Simple steps. Do it verbally and do it often. That will help keep people in their front seat and doesn't overwhelm them and push them into their back seat. Do understand if you have certain boundaries. If you have said, like, for example, I wear glasses. So when I'm with children, if they reach for my glasses, I have to put my hand up and say, I'm sorry, I won't let you touch my glasses. They're very important to me. I can't see without them. That's a boundary I have. Sometimes when we put up boundaries, it can be a trigger or it can push somebody in their back seats. You just need to be aware of that. So the way in which you set that boundary needs to be very kind and very respectful. So if a child reaches for my glasses, I don't slap their hands and tell them no. Instead, I put my hand up and block them and say, please don't touch my glasses. I can't see without them. That's a different way of setting the exact same boundary that may not trigger someone. We want to always offer choices and compromise whenever we can. A lot of the issues that push people into their backseat or their trunk is that sense of control. So if you think about it, when we are really stressed, sometimes it's because we feel vulnerable or we feel a lack of control. So we want to give choices wherever we can. And if we can compromise, we want to do that. When my children were really young, there used to be a boundary battle often with stopping doing games and starting to do chores. And one day, because I didn't know anything about games, I asked them, why is it so hard for you to stop a game when I ask you to stop? And they explained that there's those different levels. And if you're right in the middle, if you stop, you're going to lose it. And maybe you're really close to hitting that next level. So we made a compromise. And I said, if I tell you when you get to the next level, you need to stop your game and do your chores, would that be better? And they said yes. And they stuck with that boundary. So I would tell them after the next level, and they would play until that level was met and then stop. So that's showing choices and compromise. And it's also important to know that sometimes we just have to choose our moments and then move on. We want to choose our battles with people. Is it something that's really going to matter in 5 days or not? We also want to be able to move on with ourselves and be able to let that go, take a deep breath, regulate, and move ourselves back to the front seat as well. That was a lot of information about how to respond. So your reflection question is, when someone else is in the back seat, do you offer connection and calming first? Or do you try to just jump right in and talk it out and problem solve when maybe they're still in their back seat? Think about that. And then your action step is to pay attention to your emotions and make sure that you are saying, I feel angry or I feel upset. Remember, I feel is much better than I am. If I am angry, it's part of who I am. It's hard to change. If I feel angry, I know that I have control over my energy and my emotions. Then notice if when you say, I feel, that it calms that emotion and try this time to help someone else use the name it to tame it tool. Thank you so much for joining me and learning about how to respond to others. I hope to see you next time. Thanks for coming.